Hi everyone, I'm Mashechaba Khumalo. So the Minister of Finance has presented the National Budget Speech for 2024 and FNB are here to give a post-speech analysis. And I'm surrounded by a group of power women who are literally running the economy, inspiring how to live better lives and doing it all with an interest to improve your living. And so I'd like to introduce them. My panelists are Mamello Matikinca-Ngwenya, who's the FNB Chief Economist, as well as Chantal Marx, the FNB Head of Investment Research, and Ester Ochse, the FNB Integrated Advice Product Head, and Palesa Mabasa is the FNB Development Head of SME Funding. Ladies, welcome and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. So this has been predicted to be the most important budget speech. Why do you think that is, Mamello?
So I think it's a number of things, right? And I think if we also just think about the events this week, we had labor stats that came out that really paint, I guess, a dire picture of the labor market. We are also going into an election year, so there were a lot of questions around whether this is going to be an election budget. But I think, as we know, there's these competing priorities that National Treasury and the Finance Minister are constantly trying to balance. We have a very high debt level that needs to be consolidated. But at the same time, we've got structurally high unemployment. We've got infrastructure that is crumbling. So how do you balance the need to reduce expenditure in an economy that is underperforming, even according to their projections? They expect GDP growth of around 6.7% this year. And if we look at those numbers through the MTurf, they see a gradual improvement in economic activity. So how do you prop up the economy and still consolidate? So I think, they've really had to look at that, and it was, I think, it is quite challenging.
Yeah, that is a challenge, and it's a really great question that you're putting across, which I will hand over to you, Palesa, of course. I mean, would you say that the government is supporting a small business? And if so, how so? Or should small business be agitated at this point?
So I think they are supporting small business. I think the fact that nothing really was changed from a small business perspective in the speeches shows that all entrepreneurs can just focus on doing the good things well, so to just carry on, stay the course, do what you're doing well. And because there's so many things that they're juggling right now, I mean, we've got power issues with Eskom and load shedding and how that's affecting the normal guy on the corner who can't make his vet cooks, like all those type of things. If just because they didn't say SMEs, the focus was on the SMEs this time, I think it's actually a really good thing. So they're quite supportive.
Yeah, very fantastic. And in light of the challenges that we've experienced, I think I'd like to bring you in here. Chantal, after the minister's speech, would you say the rand strengthened? Did it weaken?
Well, during the speech, the rand actually strengthened quite a bit, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that government remains committed to that consolidation. They remain committed to keeping debt at sustainable levels, finding interesting ways in order to bring down that debt and to reduce the interest that they pay on that debt, so that they can actually use funds for productive purposes. And with productive purposes, I mean growing the economy. In the same breath, we also saw, well, probably related, that bond yields came down, which means bond prices went up. That's a good thing. That means that bond investors approved of the budget. And the equity market even responded positively, which means that it couldn't have been that negative for business or the consumer, because that's generally where the business and consumer impact is measured, in the equity market.
Yeah, and we'll elaborate a little bit more on that in the process of this conversation. And I'd like to know, when it comes to, especially the question that's on everyone's mind as well, petrol prices, what is your take on what the minister had to say?
Well, let's start with the good news when it comes to petrol prices.
There's been
no fuel levy increase on the petrol price. Slight increase on the carbon tax, but overall for the consumer, it's traditionally is a little bit of an inflationary adaptation on the tax brackets, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Overall, okay. I think it's a case of a little bit of short-term pain for the long-term gain. Definitely green shoots that everyone's talking about, so let's hold thumbs.
But essentially it means that we'll be paying more for fuel either way, doesn't it?
Slightly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something like 4 cents or something like that. It's
Okay.
not significant at
Yeah,
all.
I got you. And then when it comes to, I mean, I'm going to come back to you here for this, Chantal. When it comes to, for instance, when we've been speaking about whether the rand is strengthened or weakened, you say it's strengthened. If we can just elaborate a little bit more on what this means for investors.
What a stronger rand effectively means is that you have support for the South Africa Inc. basket. So that includes bonds, that includes equities that are specifically exposed to South Africa. It's specifically positive for importers because they'll be able to import their product at a lower price. And it's also an opportunity to take money offshore. Now, I'm not saying that the rand has strengthened enough to actually say, oh, well, now is the best time ever to take your money offshore. But hopefully it can be the beginning of a bit of a strengthening bias because the rand is very undervalued. And I think that perhaps this could be the trigger to see some rand strength that will offer us these opportunities and then offer support for South Africa's fiscus as well as for the SA Inc. stable of shares.
And then, Palesa, how can SMEs, for instance, maximize on the opportunities that are available at the moment?
So the budget was focused on some infrastructure investment that the minister spoke about. So from that point of view, SMEs just make sure their governance is in place. So when those tenders come out for you to be able to participate in any type of project, you've got all of the legalities, fixed and you've tightened that up. And you could be a lead or a subcontractor in any of those type of projects. So I think it's actually quite easy for SMEs to participate there.
So to add to that, I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit from a consumer's point of view. If they are sitting with excess cash at the moment, yes, we are sitting at a high interest rate environment at Mamello, which is potentially going to start coming down towards it. And it might be a time, if you're looking at what Chantal said, is to start looking at diversifying into sort of different asset classes, potentially looking at taking up some of those stocks.
Yes, I got you. And Mamello, what about the proposal to scale down outdated programs, for instance?
So what was particularly, I guess, positive about this budget is that there was really an effort to reduce the government debt to GDP, and it peaks at around 75% of GDP versus 77% that was tabled in the MTBPS. So I think that's quite important because if we look at those interest payments as well, it reduces that. So the market was really looking for indications around, okay, how are you going to deal with this huge debt burden? And, again, I think from a consumer point of view, I think we think of our budgets from that point of view. The economy is unfortunately not growing enough to reduce a government debt. We need economic growth north of 3%. And as I've highlighted, the numbers that they've forecasted are quite low. So they've utilized the tools that are at their disposal to really address that. And at the same time, they've understood that cost of living pressures, they need to think about this. So hence, from a tax point of view, we didn't see any extreme tax increases except for your sin taxes. And perhaps around SMMEs as well, there is huge encouragement in the motor sector, which came through quite notably, which could benefit SMMEs along that value chain. I think the allocation for infrastructure, also quite important, 934 billion give or take, allocated to infrastructure, very important. And another one is this hard line on state-owned entities. So if we think about budgets over the past couple of years, there's been that leniency around funding of state-owned entities. But I guess, this idea of outdated programs really also just speaks to these competing priorities that we are faced with in the economy. And the finance minister really, I think, had a very difficult job. But I think over the short term, it is a net positive budget. But over the long term, which we at some point really need to talk about that, it is not sustainable.
I'd love for Palesa to expand on
was
that. You look like you want to jump right in. This is your turn, girl.
And that's why SMEs are so important. So the more money that goes into this informal economy that now becomes more formal, and SMEs are able to now create more employment, we're going to get the stimulus again in the economy. So it is so important, and that's why I'm saying it was a positive, budget speech for SMEs, because, there was no negative for them. So if we can just focus on making sure any type of policies or programs that are there are implemented correctly, we then are able to okay, fine, we started here, this is the progress, these are the type of jobs, the impact. There's so much more that we can look forward to as a country and be able to build something more sustainable in the long term than obviously, as they say, putting a plaster over very big sores and trying to make sure that things are going to be working out later.
Yeah, I'm quite excited. Obviously in a personal, from a personal finance perspective and a consumer perspective, I'm excited about, just kind of putting those two against, or putting Mamello's world against your world again. The SOEs, they're like an adult dependent, right? You just want them out of your house. You want them to be self-sustainable, to pay for their own apartment.
Eating your groceries.
And I'm actually glad that they took this little bit of a hard line, because how are they going to learn if you don't withdraw funding, right? If you don't limit pocket money increases for your 34-year-old.
Yeah, but these issues with state-owned entities, positive in the short term, but ultimately these institutions are so critical to a well-functioning economy. We need a functioning rail system, a port system for manufacturers, for miners to be able to export their commodities into markets that demand those goods. In the absence of that, we already see it from a tax revenue point of view, that the mining sector's contribution to tax, or corporate tax just in general, it has underperformed significantly. So I think that the effort to have those conditions around state-owned entities and to invite private sector participation in resolving some of these issues that we're seeing, in Transnet. We've seen how it's worked in the electricity sector, that when you liberalize that sector just a little bit, you will see that there is appetite for participation. So obviously some of these structural constraints are not a budget issue. They're issues that should be discussed outside the budget, but I think it's quite important for government or national treasury and state-owned entities to come to some sort of agreement as what are the teething issues that we need to resolve, and how do we actually look at the market and see if we can partner with the market to improve efficiencies. We need those entities to function. For small, medium enterprises, you need to remove the friction costs, and your friction costs are ultimately electricity costs, the water costs. It's important that we get reform in those sectors to improve employment activity, to improve, I guess, the living standards of ordinary South Africans. So positive in the short term, but we really need to have a serious discussion at some point around how do we actually resolve issues around state-owned entities.
I'd like to give you all an opportunity to just, I'll be going around the room just getting your parting shots on this particular conversation, starting with you, Esther. I mean, for the viewer at home who's watching this right now, what does all of this even mean?
So I'm going to talk just specifically about the budget and the implication for the consumer. So traditionally what we would get is around about this time of year what they call an inflationary adaptation on the tax brackets. So that means at the end of February they would have had a few more rands in their pockets. That didn't happen this year. So your salary that you received in February is going to be exactly the same salary you're going to receive in March, whereas normally we had a little bit of a sort of a gap there. Good news is obviously the fuel levy as we spoke. Bad news is sin taxes. So you are going to get an above inflationary increase there. So if you smoke, if you drink, if you vape, there's lots of mention made of vaping, you're going to pay more for that. So just make sure that you work that into your budget because that's significant.
There was no mention of sugar.
There was no mention of sugar. So for those of you that have got a sweet tooth, that's good news. But then there is something that I think we need to talk about because there's lots of hype about it at the moment, is the so-called two-pot system that's coming in. And the two-pot system is from the 1st of September 2024. You can get access to a certain portion of your pension. There's certain parameters and certain limitations to that as well. And obviously we'll be doing a lot more communication on that going forward. I strongly recommend that, when this does open up, is that you don't go and you just spend that money. Rather use it for the intention, and as the Minister said, is to help people in these tough times, is help them to pay off their debt. It's not for clothing, it's not for, going to spend.
Yeah.
So that's it. I think for the consumer, it's very much a case of short-term pain, but green shoots, long-term gain, hopefully.
Okay. Well, all we can do is hope, huh? All right. So, Chantal, I mean, for the investors in stock markets, what is 2024, your predictions?
Yes, I mean, the budget, I think, was obviously more bond-friendly than equity-friendly, but I think it was neutral for equity markets like the JSE, for example. And it was more or less neutral, I think, for consumers as well, even though we didn't get that bracket creep adjustment. So overall, I think it was well received by investors, and it will probably not be an issue for investors until we get very close to the medium-term budget policy statement this year. I think all eyes will be on how the transfer from the Reserve Bank of that contingency reserve to Treasury will take place, when it will take place, and ultimately what impact it's going to have on bond yields, because that has an important impact on the returns that you can expect from the bond market, on the returns that you can expect from the stock market. I think overall from a 2024 perspective, we are quite positive regardless around market returns. Lots of volatility around the election, for example, around the US election, for example, but we do expect, and Mamello will probably highlight that as well, that interest rates have peaked both in the US and locally. They'll begin to subside probably towards the latter end of the year. Inflation is continuing to come down, even though we had a bit of a blip today, and that will be supportive for equities. It'll be supportive for the consumer as well.
And then I'll come to you, Palesa. What should SMEs be looking out for in 2024?
So looking out for the opportunities and where they can participate in the economy, given what's been announced. So Mamello mentioned the automotive tax incentive. So make sure that, as I said, from a governance perspective, you're well prepared to be able to participate. And just to go back to what Esther was saying, from an SME perspective, what's your cash flow? That's where small businesses trip up all the time. So watch your cash flow. Don't do anything too quickly and think that you're going to get quick gains just because you've done something. Stay the course, do what you're doing well, and just take your time.
And of course, last but not least, it's only fitting that we end with our chief economist of FNB. So the minister spoke about growing the pie. So Mamello, how do we grow the pie?
So I think if we break down the South African economy by sector and we look at economic performance between 1994 and 2004, give or take, and then we look at where we are, and we look at the sectors that have really suffered over the past 15 years. It is your energy intensive sectors, your mining sector has underperformed, our manufacturing sector has also, suffered during this period. So when we think about growing the pie, I think we really need to concentrate on that primary as well as secondary sectors of the economy, as we call it. So that's your mining, manufacturing, construction. That is quite important, and utilities. In that, again, it really speaks to how do we enable or create an enabling environment for entities to function. How do we support sectors that have great multipliers, that are able to create employment activity? Really think about policy that incentivizes, I think, better performance around those sectors. And I think government also just really needs to think about infrastructure and ensuring that these sectors have the necessary infrastructure to be able to thrive. I think, if we just reorientate which sectors are growing the economy currently, it's your financial services sector. Reorientated back to incentivizing our primary and secondary sectors is how we could potentially grow the pie.
Thank you so much, ladies, and thank you for your time.
It's a
Thanks
pleasure.
so much.
All right, there we have it, the expertise of some of the most dynamic think tanks, thought leaders in South Africa. FNB has brought you that post-speech analysis of Budget 2024. It's been an honor being at the forefront of it. I'm Mashechaba Khumalo, and thank you for watching.